The Griffin family from Family Guy might seem like just another dysfunctional animated sitcom family, but their history is far darker and more complex than most viewers realize. Let's start with something most fans completely overlook. The Griffin family didn't begin with Peter. The patriarch we know as the bumbling, chicken-fighting, Pawtucket patriot-chugging manchild has roots that stretch back generations. And those roots are soaked in dysfunction, violence, and secrets that would make even the darkest episodes of the show seem tame. Peter's father, Francis Griffin, was introduced as a strict Irish Catholic who spent most of his screen time berating his son. But what the show rarely explored was why Francis became such a bitter, angry man. Francis grew up in Ireland during some of the country's most turbulent times, and while the show plays this for laughs occasionally, the reality of his upbringing shaped everything about how he raised Peter. Francis came from a long line of hard-drinking, hard-living Irish laborers who believed that showing affection was weakness, and that the only way to raise a man was through discipline and humiliation. His own father, Peter's grandfather, was reportedly even worse, a man who would disappear for weeks on end, only to return drunk and violent, taking out his failures on anyone within reach. When Francis immigrated to America, he brought all of that generational trauma with him. He met Thelma, Peter's mother, at a church social, and their relationship was built more on Catholic obligation than genuine affection. Thelma came from her own troubled background, though the show barely touches on this. She grew up in a strict religious household where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and dedicated entirely to their husbands and the church. Her father was a deacon who ruled his home with an iron fist disguised as godly righteousness. Thelma learned early that the way to survive was to stay quiet, keep her head down, and never question authority. This explains so much about why she stayed with Francis, despite his obvious emotional abuse toward their son. She had been conditioned from birth to believe that a woman's role was to suffer silently, and that speaking up about mistreatment was a sin. Peter was born into this toxic environment, and from day one, Francis made it clear that his son was a disappointment. The earliest memories Peter has shared on the show involve his father criticizing him, mocking him, and comparing him unfavorably to other children. Francis wanted a son who would be strong, successful, and most importantly, make the Griffin name mean something in their community. Instead, he got Peter, a boy who struggled in school, had trouble following directions, and seemed more interested in making people laugh than in achieving anything Francis considered worthwhile. The psychological damage this caused cannot be overstated. Peter's entire personality, his desperate need for approval, his inability to think before he acts, his constant seeking of attention through increasingly outrageous behavior, all of it traces back to a childhood where nothing he did was ever good enough for the one person whose approval he craved most. What makes this even more tragic is that Francis had a brother, Peter's uncle, who was everything Francis wanted Peter to be. This uncle, rarely mentioned in the show, was successful, respected in the community, and had a family that Francis constantly held up as the model Peter should aspire to. The few times young Peter interacted with this uncle and his cousins, he felt even more inadequate. His cousins excelled at sports, got good grades, and seemed to do everything right without even trying. Family gatherings became torture sessions where Peter would be compared unfavorably to these perfect relatives, with Francis never missing an opportunity to point out how Peter was failing the Griffin name. This created a deep-seated resentment in Peter toward not just his father, but toward the entire concept of family success and achievement. Thelma tried in her own way to shield Peter from the worst of Francis's criticism, but her methods were often just as damaging. She would coddle Peter, tell him he was special just the way he was, and give him sweets and treats to make up for his father's harshness. This created a dynamic where Peter learned that he could avoid consequences and responsibility by playing the victim, and that there would always be someone to rescue him from his own bad decisions. Thelma's enabling set patterns in Peter's life that would continue into his adulthood. She never taught him accountability because she herself had never been allowed to hold anyone accountable. In her worldview, men did what they wanted, and women cleaned up the mess. This belief system was so deeply ingrained that she passed it on to Peter without even realizing it. Now, let's talk about something the show revealed in one of its most shocking moments: Peter's real father. The revelation that Francis was not Peter's biological father came late in the series, but the implications of this are staggering when you really think about them. Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish drunk who had a brief affair with Thelma, is Peter's actual biological father. This means that everything Francis did to Peter, all the criticism, all the emotional abuse, all the constant disappointment, was directed at a child who wasn't even his own. Francis knew, or at least suspected this, and it colored every interaction he ever had with Peter. The cruelty makes more sense now, doesn't it? Francis wasn't just disappointed in his son. He was punishing Thelma's betrayal through the child that betrayal produced. But here's what the show doesn't explore. How did this affair happen? Thelma, the devout Catholic who never questioned her role as a submissive wife, somehow ended up in bed with Mickey McFinnigan. The timeline suggests this happened relatively early in her marriage to Francis, which means the relationship was already broken before Peter was even conceived. What was Thelma's life really like with Francis in those early years? We can piece it together from context clues. Francis was working long hours at the factory, coming home angry and frustrated about his lot in life. He likely took out those frustrations on Thelma, not necessarily physically, but through neglect and emotional distance. She was lonely, isolated in a new country far from her own family, stuck in a loveless marriage that she couldn't leave because of her religious beliefs. Enter Mickey McFinnigan, a charming Irish immigrant who probably reminded Thelma of home. He was fun, attentive, and most importantly, he made her feel seen in a way Francis never had. The affair was probably brief, maybe only 1 or 2 encounters, but it was enough. When Thelma realized she was pregnant, she must have been terrified. Did she know it was Mickey's child? Did she hope it was Francis's? Or did she simply push down the doubt and pray that God would forgive her sin? We'll never know for sure, but what we do know is that she returned to Francis, raised Peter as his son, and lived with that secret for decades. The guilt must have been overwhelming, and it explains so much about why she overcompensated with Peter, why she was so protective, why she enabled his worst behaviors. Every time she looked at Peter, she saw her sin made flesh, and she spent his entire childhood trying to make up for it. Francis eventually figured it out, or at least suspected strongly enough that it affected how he treated Peter. There were probably moments where Peter did something, made a face, laughed in a certain way, and Francis saw Mickey instead of himself. These moments would have enraged Francis, not at Mickey or even at Thelma, but at Peter himself, the living evidence of his wife's betrayal and his own inadequacy. This is why Francis could never bring himself to show Peter any affection, why every interaction was poisoned with resentment. Francis wasn't just a bad father. He was a man tormented by the knowledge that the child he was raising was living proof that he couldn't even keep his own wife faithful. The psychological impact on Peter of growing up in this environment cannot be overstated. Children instinctively know when something is wrong, even if they can't articulate what it is. Peter grew up feeling his father's hatred, but never understanding why. He blamed himself, internalized the criticism, and developed coping mechanisms that would define his entire personality. His attention-seeking behavior, his inability to think things through, his desperate need to be liked by everyone around him. These are all trauma responses from a childhood spent trying and failing to earn his father's love. Peter's relationship with his own children is directly influenced by this upbringing. He swings wildly between Francis's harsh criticism and Thelma's overindulgence, never finding a healthy middle ground because he never experienced one himself. Now let's shift focus to Lois Pewterschmidt, because Peter didn't marry into a normal family either. In fact, one could argue that the Pewterschmidt family is even more dysfunctional than the Griffins. They're just better at hiding it behind money and social status. Lois came from serious wealth, the kind of old money that buys influence and covers up scandals. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, is presented on the show as a typical rich villain type, greedy, ruthless, and casually racist. But there's so much more to the Pewterschmidt family history that explains not just who Carter is, but why Lois made the choices she did. The Pewterschmidt fortune was built on what we'd politely call morally questionable business practices. Carter inherited a company from his father, but the real money came from deals made during wartime, exploiting labor and making strategic alliances with some very unsavory people. The Pewterschmidt family tree includes several generations of men who believed that money entitled them to anything they wanted, and I mean anything. There are hints throughout the show about the family's dark past, the way Carter talks about his father, the old photographs and artifacts at the Pewterschmidt mansion, the casual way they discuss business deals that ruined lives. This wasn't just a rich family. This was a dynasty built on the backs of people they considered beneath them. Carter's father, Lois's grandfather, was by all accounts even worse than Carter himself. He was a man who lived during the early industrial age, when robber barons could quite literally get away with murder if they had enough money. He ran his factories with no regard for worker safety, paid starvation wages, and crushed any attempt at unionization with hired thugs. He cheated business partners, bribed politicians, and used his wealth to make problems and people disappear. He also ran his household the same way he ran his businesses, with an iron fist and absolute authority. Carter grew up watching his father wield power without consequences, and he learned that money meant you never had to be accountable for anything. But here's something the show only hints at: the Pewterschmidt women. Carter's mother, Lois's grandmother, was a socialite who came from her own wealthy family. She was raised to be an ornament, to look beautiful, host parties, and never question her husband's business or personal affairs. She knew about his infidelities, his shady deals, his casual cruelty, and she said nothing because that's what women in her position did. They enjoyed the money and the status and turned a blind eye to how it was obtained and maintained. She passed this worldview on to Barbara, Lois's mother, who in turn tried to pass it on to Lois. This is crucial to understanding who Lois is and why she ended up with Peter. Barbara Pewterschmidt was raised to marry well, which she did when she married Carter. But what the show doesn't explore is what Barbara gave up to become Mrs. Pewterschmidt. There are hints that she had dreams of her own once, maybe artistic ambitions or a desire to do something meaningful with her life. But those dreams were crushed by the expectations of her family and social class. She married Carter because that's what she was supposed to do, and then she spent her entire marriage maintaining the facade of perfection, while her husband built his fortune through ruthless business practices and casual cruelty. Barbara learned to cope through pills, alcohol, and pretending that everything was fine, a coping mechanism she would inadvertently teach to her daughter. Lois grew up in this environment of wealth, privilege, and deep dysfunction. She had every material advantage, but was starved for genuine affection and authenticity. Carter was never around, always focused on his business empire, and when he was around, he was critical and demanding. He had expectations for who Lois should be, who she should marry, what kind of life she should lead. Barbara was physically present, but emotionally absent, numbed by her own disappointments and regrets. Lois was raised by nannies and sent to expensive private schools where she was surrounded by other rich kids who were just as emotionally neglected as she was. This is where Lois's wild streak comes from, the one the show occasionally references through flashbacks to her youth. Lois rebelled against her upbringing in the only way she knew how, by engaging in increasingly risky behavior. She experimented with drugs, had affairs with inappropriate men, and got herself into situations that should have had serious consequences, but didn't, because Carter's money and influence always made the problems go away. Every time Lois got into trouble, Carter would write a check, make some calls, and the issue would disappear. This taught Lois that actions didn't have real consequences if you had enough money, a lesson that would affect her decision-making for the rest of her life. The most significant of Lois's youthful rebellions was her time as a kleptomaniac. The show played this for laughs, but think about what it really means. A wealthy young woman who could buy anything she wanted was stealing things. This wasn't about need. It was about the thrill, about doing something forbidden, about feeling something real in a life that was otherwise carefully controlled and emotionally empty. Lois was stealing because it was one of the few things she did that felt like it was truly her choice, even though it was actually just another form of self-destruction. Then there was Lois's stint in rehab, which the show mentions but never fully explores. What was Lois using? How bad did it get? The fact that she ended up in rehab suggests it was serious enough that even Carter's tolerance for covering up scandals had limits. Lois was probably using cocaine, given the time period and her social circle, but there might have been other substances involved too. The rehab stay was likely at some exclusive facility where rich kids went to dry out away from prying eyes. It was there that Lois probably first started to realize that her life needed to change, that she couldn't keep living the way she was living. But she didn't know how to change because she had no model for what a healthy life looked like. When Lois met Peter, she saw an escape. Here was a guy who was everything her father would hate: working class, not particularly bright, with no prospects and no family money. Peter represented freedom from the Pewterschmidt expectations, a chance to live a normal life, to be with someone who wanted her for herself and not for her family connections or wealth. Of course, this was incredibly naive. Lois was romanticizing poverty and ordinariness because she'd never actually experienced it. She had no idea what it meant to struggle financially, to worry about bills, to have to make do with less. She just knew she wanted out of her gilded cage, and Peter was her escape route. Carter and Barbara were horrified when Lois announced she was marrying Peter. Carter saw Peter as a joke, a fat, working-class idiot who was after his daughter's money. He probably had Peter investigated, looking for any reason to pay him off or threaten him into leaving Lois alone. When that didn't work, Carter tried cutting Lois off financially, thinking that would bring her to her senses. But Lois was committed to this rebellion, and she married Peter anyway. What she didn't realize was that in trying to escape one form of dysfunction, she was running straight into another. Peter and Lois's early marriage was probably the happiest time in both their lives, but it was built on illusions. Peter thought he'd won the lottery, marrying this beautiful, sophisticated woman way out of his league. He didn't understand that Lois was using him as much as he was benefiting from her. Lois thought she'd found authenticity and real love, but she didn't understand that Peter's working-class background came with its own set of dysfunctions and traumas. Neither of them was emotionally equipped to build a healthy relationship because neither of them had ever seen what one looked like. The cracks started showing early. Peter's immaturity, which Lois had found charming when they were dating, became frustrating when she was trying to run a household. Lois's occasional desire for the finer things in life, which she'd suppressed during her rebellion phase, started creeping back. They had Chris, then Meg, then Stewie, and with each child, the reality of their situation became harder to ignore. They were struggling financially because Peter couldn't hold down a job, and Lois had no real work skills because she'd never needed them. The independence Lois craved was actually just a different kind of trap, one where she was stuck with a man-child husband in a too-small house in a nowhere town. This brings us to the Griffin children, each one a product of their parents' unresolved traumas and dysfunctions. Let's start with Meg, the family scapegoat. Meg's treatment by the family is one of the darkest running jokes in the show, but when you really examine it, It's not funny at all. It's a tragedy. Meg was the first child, born when Peter and Lois were still young and unprepared for parenthood. She was also born during a particularly difficult time in their marriage, when the honeymoon phase was ending, and the reality of their incompatibility was setting in. Lois was probably dealing with postpartum depression, which went undiagnosed and untreated because Lois didn't want to admit she was struggling. Peter was overwhelmed by the responsibility of fatherhood and did what he always did when things got hard. He checked out emotionally. Meg grew up feeling unwanted from day one, and children who feel unwanted will do anything to try to earn love and acceptance. This explains all of Meg's desperate attempts to fit in, to be popular, to be pretty, to be anything other than what she is. The family's treatment of her only reinforced her feelings of worthlessness. Peter openly mocks her. Lois is cold and critical. Chris is indifferent, and even baby Stewie targets her with his cruelty. Meg has been conditioned to believe that her role in the family is to be the target, to absorb all the dysfunction and anger so that everyone else can feel better about themselves. This is not just emotional abuse. It's systematic scapegoating, and it's destroying Meg's sense of self. What makes it worse is that Meg has internalized this treatment. She believes she deserves it, that there's something fundamentally wrong with her, that she's lucky her family tolerates her at all. This is why she stays, why she keeps trying to earn their love, why she occasionally has breakdowns where she lashes out, but then immediately retreats back into her role as the family punching bag. Meg is trapped in a cycle of abuse, and the saddest part is that she can't see a way out, because this is all she's ever known. When she does occasionally find people outside the family who treat her well, she doesn't trust it because she's been taught that she doesn't deserve kindness. The episode where Meg finally stands up to the family and explains that she lets them abuse her because the family would fall apart without a scapegoat is one of the darkest moments in the show. She's not wrong. The Griffin family uses Meg as a pressure release valve for all their anger, resentment, and frustration. Without her to target, they'd turn on each other. Meg has martyred herself for the family's stability, and they don't even appreciate it. They just accept it as normal. This is generational trauma in action. Peter learned from Francis that it's acceptable to have a target for your rage. Lois learned from her family that some people are expendable if it means maintaining the status quo. And they're teaching Chris and Stewie that cruelty to those weaker than you is not just acceptable, but expected. Chris is another tragic figure, though the show plays him mostly for laughs. Chris inherited the worst traits from both sides of his family: Peter's stupidity and Lois's tendency towards self-destruction. Chris is not just dumb, he's intellectually disabled in a way that should concern everyone around him, but doesn't because the family has normalized it. Peter sees Chris's stupidity, and rather than getting him help, he celebrates it because it makes Peter feel smarter by comparison. Lois ignores the signs because addressing them would mean admitting that something is wrong, and Pewterschmidts don't admit weakness. Chris has also inherited Peter's disturbing relationship with his own body and sexuality. There are numerous episodes that hint at Chris's sexual dysfunction, his obsession with porn, his inappropriate behavior toward women, his inability to form healthy relationships. This is all learned behavior from Peter, who has never modeled appropriate boundaries or respect for women. Chris watches his father treat his mother with disrespect, sees Peter's constant infidelity and sexual inappropriateness, and absorbs the lesson that this is how men behave. Without intervention, Chris is going to grow up to be Peter, maybe even worse than Peter because Chris lacks even the minimal self-awareness that Peter occasionally displays. There's also the concerning issue of Chris's relationship with his own identity. He's overshadowed by Stewie's genius, mocked for being stupid, and generally treated as if he doesn't matter. Chris has learned that the only time people pay attention to him is when he does something wrong, or when he's the butt of a joke. This has shaped his entire personality. He acts out for attention, makes poor decisions because no one expects anything better from him anyway, and has zero ambition or drive, because why bother when everyone has already decided you're going to amount to nothing? And then there's Stewie, the evil genius baby who wants to kill his mother and take over the world. Except when you really examine Stewie's character, the evil genius thing is clearly a defense mechanism. Stewie is arguably the most psychologically damaged member of the family, and that's saying something. Here's a baby, the most vulnerable human being there is, trapped in a family where neglect and emotional abuse are the norm. Stewie's intelligence makes it worse because he's aware of how dysfunctional everything is, but he's powerless to change it or escape it. His plans for world domination, his elaborate schemes, his sophisticated inventions, these are all ways of exerting control in a life where he has none. Stewie's stated desire to kill Lois is particularly disturbing when you think about it beyond the joke. Babies who want to kill their mothers are expressing rage at the person they're most dependent on, the person who should be protecting and nurturing them, but isn't. Lois is neglectful of Stewie in ways both subtle and overt. She leaves him with Brian, a dog, for extended periods. She ignores his obvious signs of distress. She's too wrapped up in her own issues to properly bond with him. Stewie's homicidal fantasies toward Lois are a baby's way of processing the anger he feels at being abandoned emotionally by the person he needs most. Then there's Stewie's confusion about his sexuality, which the show plays for laughs, but is actually quite sad. Stewie's sexuality is all over the place because he's a child who has received no healthy modeling of relationships, gender, or intimacy. He doesn't know who he is or what he wants because he's growing up in an environment where love is conditional, affection is rare, and emotional intimacy is non-existent. Stewie's sexual confusion is not about whether he's gay, or straight, or bisexual. It's about a child trying to understand human connection in a family where human connection is broken. And we have to talk about Stewie's relationship with Brian, which is probably the most stable relationship in Stewie's life. And that's horrifying when you remember Brian is a dog. Stewie has bonded with Brian because Brian is the only one who treats him with any consistency and respect. Yes, Brian is narcissistic and flawed, but he actually listens to Stewie, engages with him intellectually, and doesn't dismiss him just because he's a baby. The fact that Stewie's primary attachment figure is not his parents, but the family pet, speaks volumes about how emotionally neglected this child is. Brian himself deserves his own deep dive because he's arguably the most self-aware character in the family about how dysfunctional everything is. Yet he enables it all. Brian came into the Griffin family as Peter's pet, but he quickly became something else entirely. Brian positions himself as the voice of reason, the intellectual, the one who's above all the Griffin chaos. But this is a facade. Brian is just as damaged as everyone else. He's just better at hiding it behind pretension and false sophistication. Let's talk about Brian's past, which the show has explored in bits and pieces. Brian was separated from his mother as a puppy, sold or given away, and bounced around before ending up with Peter. This early trauma of maternal abandonment has shaped everything about Brian's personality. He's desperate for love and validation, but terrified of commitment. He falls in love easily, but sabotages every relationship. He acts superior to everyone around him, but is crippled by self-loathing. Brian is the classic example of someone who intellectualizes their trauma rather than processing it. Brian's alcoholism is another sign of deep psychological problems that the family just accepts as normal. Brian drinks constantly, and it's played for laughs, but when you really look at it, Brian is using alcohol the same way Barbara Pewterschmidt uses pills and booze, to numb the pain of a life that's not what he wants it to be. Brian had dreams of being a writer, of being someone important and respected. Instead, he's a failed novelist living with the Griffins, financially dependent on Peter, and going nowhere. He drinks to cope with the disappointment of his own mediocrity. Brian's relationships with women are particularly troubling. He's been with numerous women, usually women who are too good for him, and he consistently screws it up through his own neuroses and self-sabotage. He cheated on Jillian, pushed away Rita, and ruined things with pretty much every decent woman who showed interest in him. Brian wants to be loved, but doesn't believe he deserves love. So he destroys relationships before they can get serious enough to hurt him. This pattern is textbook for someone with abandonment issues stemming from early childhood trauma. There's also Brian's bizarre and inappropriate attraction to Lois, which the show has hinted at multiple times. This is incredibly disturbing on multiple levels. Brian lives in the house as essentially a family member, making his sexual interest in Lois a form of pseudo-incest. But it makes sense when you understand Brian's psychology. Lois represents everything Brian thinks he wants. She's cultured, she's from money, she's attractive, she's unattainable. Brian's attraction to Lois is not really about Lois. It's about his need to prove his worth by winning the affection of someone he perceives as higher status than himself. Now let's circle back to some of the forgotten and rarely mentioned members of the extended Griffin and Pewterschmidt families, because they shed even more light on the generational dysfunction at play. Peter has a sister named Karen who has appeared occasionally on the show. Karen got out of the toxic Griffin household and made something of her life, but the cost was cutting herself off almost entirely from the family. Karen saw what Frances was doing to Peter and to Thelma, and she decided she wouldn't let it happen to her. She studied hard, went to college, and created distance between herself and her family of origin. But you can see in her interactions with Peter that she carries guilt about leaving him behind in that environment. She also has her own anger issues and struggles with intimacy, suggesting that she didn't escape the family trauma as cleanly as she might want to believe. Then there's Lois's sister Carol, who married into the Pewterschmidt family's dysfunction by marrying Ted. Carol represents another path Lois could have taken, staying adjacent to wealth and status, but not quite achieving it herself. Carol's marriage to Ted was clearly unhappy, and their eventual divorce was brutal. Carol has her own issues with self-worth and has made numerous poor decisions in relationships, always looking for a man to complete her rather than building her own identity. The Pewterschmidt sisters both learn from Barbara that a woman's worth comes from the man she's with, and both have suffered for it in different ways. Carter has a brother who is mentioned a few times, a man who was even more ruthless in business than Carter, but ended up losing everything in a bad deal. This uncle's fall from grace terrified Carter because it showed him how quickly Pewterschmidt money and status could evaporate. This fear drives much of Carter's behavior, his ruthlessness, his need to constantly grow his wealth, his refusal to help family members who he perceives as weak or failures. Carter saw what happened to his brother and decided he would never let it happen to him, no matter who he had to step on to maintain his position. There are also hints throughout the show about other Pewterschmidt relatives who met bad ends or who were cut off from the family fortune. The Pewterschmidts have a history of disowning family members who don't live up to their standards or who threaten the family's reputation. Lois herself was nearly cut off when she married Peter, and Carter has threatened to disinherit her numerous times. This is the family model Lois grew up with. Love and acceptance are conditional, based entirely on whether you're useful to the family's interests. Is it any wonder that Lois struggles to show unconditional love to her own children? Peter's relationship with his children mirrors his relationship with his own father in disturbing ways. Peter is critical of Meg, dismissive of Chris, and neglectful of Stewie, just as Frances was critical, dismissive, and neglectful of Peter. Peter swore he'd never be like his father, but without any tools or understanding of how to break the cycle, he's simply repeating it. The same patterns play out generation after generation. The father who can't show affection, the mother who enables dysfunction, the children who grow up damaged, and then damage their own children. Lois's relationship with her children reflects her own upbringing as well. She's emotionally distant, critical of perceived flaws, and more concerned with how the children reflect on her than with their actual well-being. Lois wanted to be a different kind of mother than Barbara was, but she didn't know how. She ping-pongs between Barbara's cold detachment and overcompensating with indulgence, never finding a healthy middle ground. Her treatment of Meg, in particular, echoes how the Pewter-Schmidt family treats anyone they deem unworthy or embarrassing. The family's relationship with money is another inherited dysfunction. Peter has no concept of financial responsibility, spending money on ridiculous schemes and impulse purchases without thinking about consequences. This is partly his own childishness, but also reflects the fact that he grew up poor and has never learned to manage money properly. Whenever they get a windfall, Peter immediately wastes it because he has no understanding of planning for the future or saving for emergencies. Lois enables this because she grew up with infinite money and has never truly adjusted to living within normal financial constraints. She'll lecture Peter about his spending and then turn around and spend frivolously herself because deep down, she still thinks of money as something that will always be there. When they do have money problems, rather than addressing them as a team, Peter and Lois turn on each other. Peter blames Lois for not being able to access her family's wealth. Lois blames Peter for being a failure as a provider. Neither takes real responsibility for the financial decisions they both make. This creates an environment where the children learn that money is something to fight about, not something to plan for or manage responsibly. Is it any surprise that none of the Griffin children seem to have any concept of financial literacy or responsibility? The cycle of addiction in the family is another forgotten aspect of the Griffin history. Francis drank heavily, and while Peter doesn't have the same relationship with alcohol that his father did, he clearly has an addictive personality that manifests in other ways. His obsession with television, his inability to moderate his behavior in anything, his compulsive need for attention and approval. These are all signs of someone with addictive tendencies. Brian is an outright alcoholic, and no one in the family seems to see this as a problem, probably because they've normalized addiction through generations of exposure to it. Lois comes from a family where self-medication was the norm. Barbara's pill popping and drinking were just how she coped with her disappointment and unhappiness. Carter uses work as his addiction, an escape from dealing with emotions or family relationships. Lois herself has had issues with pills, alcohol, and other substances at various points in her life. She's better at hiding it and managing it than Brian is, but the tendency is there. The children are growing up in an environment where using substances or obsessive behaviors to cope with negative emotions is completely normalized. Stewie already shows signs of obsessive-compulsive behavior, and Chris's relationship with food and pornography suggests he's developing his own addictive patterns. The physical violence in the family is something that gets played for laughs, but is actually quite disturbing. Peter and Lois have physical fights that would be classified as domestic violence in any real-world context. Peter has been physically violent with Meg. The family accepts violence as a normal part of conflict resolution because it's been normalized through generations. Francis was likely physically abusive to Peter, though the show doesn't explicitly confirm this, and Peter has unconsciously adopted the belief that physical intimidation and violence are acceptable ways to assert authority or express anger. The emotional violence is even worse because it's constant and insidious. The verbal abuse that Meg endures, the constant put-downs and criticism, the complete lack of support or encouragement, this is violence that leaves scars you can't see. Chris is told constantly that he's stupid, that he'll never amount to anything, that he's a disappointment. Stewie's emotional needs are ignored or mocked. This is a family that has no concept of healthy emotional expression or support. They don't know how to communicate feelings without either suppressing them entirely or exploding in rage. Let's talk about the pattern of infidelity in the family, because this is another generational issue. Francis was almost certainly unfaithful to Thelma, and Thelma's affair with Mickey was likely a response to Francis's betrayals, as much as it was anything else. The Pewterschmidt men have a history of keeping mistresses and engaging in affairs because they believe their wealth and status entitle them to whatever they want. Carter has almost certainly been unfaithful to Barbara throughout their marriage, and Barbara has looked the other way because that's what Pewterschmidt wives do. Peter and Lois have both been unfaithful to each other multiple times. They've separated, reconciled, and continued the cycle. Peter's infidelities are often played for laughs or portrayed as mistakes that happen because Peter is too dumb to know better. But that's not an excuse. Peter is repeatedly unfaithful because he's selfish, impulsive, and has no real understanding of commitment or consequences. Lois's infidelities are often portrayed as reactions to Peter's behavior, but they reveal her own issues with commitment and her ongoing struggle with whether she made the right choice in marrying Peter. The children are learning from all of this that commitment is optional, that marriage vows are suggestions rather than promises, that it's acceptable to hurt the people you claim to love as long as you say you're sorry afterward. This is setting them up for their own relationship failures in the future. Meg is already desperate for male attention and willing to accept any scraps of affection, even from completely inappropriate men. Chris shows signs of objectifying women and not understanding healthy boundaries. Stewie's cynicism about relationships and love is far too developed for a child his age, suggesting he's already absorbed the lesson that people who claim to love you will hurt you. There's also the issue of how the family deals with mental health, which is to say, they don't deal with it at all. Peter clearly has some form of cognitive disability or brain damage that affects his impulse control and decision-making, but this is never diagnosed or treated. Lois shows signs of depression and anxiety, but refuses to acknowledge it because Pewterschmidts don't admit to mental weakness. Brian is depressed and uses alcohol to self-medicate rather than seeking actual help. Stewie exhibits concerning behaviors that any child psychologist would want to evaluate, but of course, no one thinks to take him to one. Meg desperately needs therapy for the abuse and neglect she's experienced, but the family would never consider it, because that would require admitting their part of the problem. Chris needs educational and possibly psychological support for his cognitive issues, but Peter sees getting help as admitting weakness. The Griffin family's approach to mental health is to ignore it, mock it, or drink it away, perpetuating the cycle of dysfunction into yet another generation. The family's relationship with religion is another complicated aspect of their history. Francis was a strict Catholic who used religion as a weapon to control and judge others, rather than as a source of comfort or community. He believed in a punishing God who kept score of every sin and demanded suffering and sacrifice. This is the version of Catholicism he tried to force on Peter, who naturally rebelled against it. Peter's relationship with religion as an adult is confused and contradictory, sometimes claiming to be devout, and other times openly mocking religious beliefs. This reflects his unresolved feelings about his father, and about the role religion played in his childhood abuse. Lois comes from a Protestant background, where religion was more about social status than genuine faith. The Pewterschmidts went to church because that's what respectable families did, not because they believed in any of it. Barbara used religion, as she used everything else, as a tool for maintaining appearances. This shallow relationship with faith left Lois with no spiritual foundation to fall back on during difficult times. She occasionally tries to instill religious values in her children, but doesn't really believe in what she's teaching. So it comes across as hollow and hypocritical. The result is that the Griffin children are growing up with no consistent moral or spiritual framework. They see their parents invoke God when it's convenient and ignore religious teachings when they're inconvenient. They learn that morality is flexible, that rules apply to other people, but not to them, that consequences are things that happen to other people. Without any strong ethical foundation, they're adrift, making decisions based on immediate gratification rather than any deeper sense of right and wrong. Let's discuss Peter's employment history, because it's a perfect illustration of generational failure and dysfunction. Francis worked at the mill his entire life, a soul-crushing job that he hated but stuck with out of a sense of duty, and because he lacked the imagination or courage to do anything else. He instilled in Peter a conflicting set of messages: that real men work hard at jobs they hate to support their families, but also that Peter would never be good enough to succeed at anything meaningful. This set Peter up for a life of job hopping and failure. Peter has been fired from countless jobs, sometimes for legitimate reasons like incompetence, but often because his arrested development makes him incapable of functioning in a normal workplace. He can't follow instructions, can't get along with coworkers, can't control his impulses, and can't think about consequences. Each job loss reinforces Peter's fundamental belief, learned from Francis, that he's a failure. But instead of motivating him to improve, it just confirms his expectation that nothing he does will ever work out. So why bother trying? Lois was raised to believe that she'd never need to work, that she'd marry a successful man who would provide for her while she managed the household and raise children. When that didn't happen, she was completely unprepared. Her occasional jobs throughout the series show that she has potential and intelligence, but she has no work ethic or professional skills because she never developed them. The Pewterschmidt fortune was always there as a safety net, which meant Lois never had to face the real consequences of their financial mismanagement. This safety net is a form of enabling that has allowed both Peter and Lois to remain perpetual children who never fully grow up or take responsibility for their lives. The impact on the children is predictable. Meg desperately wants to succeed and be normal, but she has no models for how to do that. She works hard at school and at her various jobs, but she lacks confidence and self-worth because her family has never valued her efforts. Chris has absorbed the lesson that trying is pointless because he's too dumb to succeed at anything anyway. Stewie is the only one with real potential, but he's so damaged by his family environment that his gifts may end up being wasted or misdirected toward destructive ends. One of the most forgotten aspects of the Griffin family history is their relationship with death and loss. The show plays death for laughs constantly, with characters dying and coming back, or deaths being treated as inconsequential. But this casual relationship with mortality reflects a deeper dysfunction in how the family processes grief and loss. When Loretta Brown, Cleveland's first wife, died, the Griffins barely reacted beyond making it about themselves. When Peter's mother Thelma died, Peter processed it by getting into hijinks rather than actually grieving. This inability to process grief properly comes from both family lines. The Griffins and Pewterschmidts both come from backgrounds where showing emotion was seen as weakness. Francis never taught Peter how to express or process difficult emotions, only how to suppress them or channel them into anger. The Pewterschmidts believe that emotional control is a sign of breeding and class, that openly grieving or expressing sadness is somehow vulgar. So the Griffin children are growing up learning that when something painful happens, you don't feel it, you don't talk about it, you just move on and pretend it never happened. This suppression of grief and pain is incredibly damaging. It means that the family never heals from traumas. They just accumulate them. Each loss, each disappointment, each betrayal gets added to the pile of unprocessed pain that everyone is carrying around. This is why small things can trigger huge reactions in the Griffin household, because those small things are hitting the pile of accumulated trauma that no one has ever dealt with properly. The family's isolation is another forgotten aspect of their dysfunction. Despite living in Quahog for years, the Griffins have very few real friends or connections to the community. Peter's friend group consists of 3 guys he drinks with at a bar, which is not exactly a support network. Lois is even more isolated, with no real friends to speak of. The children have struggled to form lasting friendships, partly because their home environment is so chaotic and dysfunctional that they can't model healthy relationships. This isolation is both a cause and an effect of the family's dysfunction. They're isolated because their behavior drives people away. But the isolation also means they have no outside perspective on how abnormal their family dynamics are. They're trapped in their own dysfunctional bubble, with no one to tell them that the way they treat each other isn't normal or okay. When outsiders do try to point out problems, the family circles the wagons and rejects the criticism, protecting the dysfunctional system they've built. Let's talk about the pattern of schemes and get-rich-quick plots that Peter constantly engages in. This is not just Peter being silly, it's a symptom of deeper issues. Peter grew up poor and has always been desperate to prove that he's successful, that he's not the failure his father said he was. Every scheme, every business idea, every ridiculous plan is Peter trying to find the shortcut to success because he doesn't believe he's capable of achieving it through normal means. He's been conditioned to believe that hard work and discipline won't pay off for someone like him, so he's always looking for the angle, the lucky break, the one big score that will change everything. Lois enables these schemes, sometimes reluctantly, but often enthusiastically, because she's also still trying to escape her own sense of having failed to live up to her potential. When Peter comes up with a new idea, Lois sees a chance that maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time they'll actually succeed at something and prove everyone wrong. She wants to believe in Peter's potential because believing in him helps her believe that she didn't make a complete mistake in marrying him and giving up her family's money and status. The children learn from this that normal paths to success are for other people, that rules don't apply, that you should always be looking for the angle or the shortcut. They see their parents fail over and over, but never learn from those failures, never adjust their approach, never develop discipline or work ethic. This sets up the next generation for the same cycle of grand plans and spectacular failures. There's also the issue of how the family deals with authority and rules. Peter has been arrested numerous times, has broken countless laws, and generally operates as if societal rules don't apply to him. This sense of being above the law comes from both his working-class background, where rules were seen as tools of oppression by the wealthy, and from Lois's actual upper-class background, where rules genuinely didn't apply because money could make any problem go away. The combination creates a household where the children learn that laws and rules are suggestions that apply to other people. Meg is the only one who seems to understand that actions have consequences, possibly because she's the only one who actually faces consequences in the family. But even Meg's understanding is warped by her environment. She follows rules obsessively because she's desperate for approval, not because she has any real moral framework for understanding why the rules exist. Chris and Stewie are growing up believing that they can do whatever they want and someone will bail them out or make the problems go away. The forgotten truth about the Griffin family is that they're trapped in cycles of generational trauma that no one acknowledges or addresses. Peter is repeating his father's failures. Lois is perpetuating her family's emotional dysfunction. The children are learning the same toxic patterns that will plague them for the rest of their lives unless something breaks the cycle. The tragedy is that everyone in the family is suffering. Everyone is damaged, but they don't know how to help themselves or each other because they've never seen what healthy looks like. Francis Griffin died without ever telling Peter he loved him, without ever apologizing for the decades of abuse and criticism, without ever acknowledging that his treatment of Peter was wrong. He died still angry, still bitter, still convinced that Peter was a disappointment. The worst part is that Peter never got the closure he needed. He never got to hear his father say he was proud of him. He never got the apology he deserved. So Peter is stuck in this permanent state of trying to prove himself to a dead man, trying to earn approval from someone who can no longer give it. This unresolved trauma affects every aspect of Peter's life and relationships. Thelma died with her secret about Peter's paternity intact, and when the truth eventually came out, it recontextualized Peter's entire childhood but didn't give him any tools to process it. Learning that Francis wasn't his biological father should have been liberating, should have helped Peter understand that Francis's cruelty wasn't really about him, but instead, it just added another layer of trauma, another betrayal, another secret that had poisoned his life without his knowledge. Mickey McFinnigan, Peter's biological father, is everything Francis wasn't. Warm, affectionate, emotionally available. But Peter met him too late in life to benefit from having that kind of father figure. The relationship with Mickey is bittersweet because it shows Peter what he could have had if circumstances had been different. Every moment Peter spends with Mickey is a reminder of what he missed out on, of the childhood he should have had, of the father he needed but never got when it mattered most. Carter Pewterschmidt is still alive and as terrible as ever, still trying to control Lois's life, still treating Peter with contempt, still believing that money and status are the only things that matter. Carter represents the opposite extreme from Francis, where Francis had no money but was emotionally abusive. Carter has unlimited money and is emotionally abusive. Neither man ever learned how to show love or support to their children. Carter's continued presence in the family's life means that Lois never gets to fully escape her toxic upbringing. Every interaction with her father reinforces all the negative messages she grew up with about her worth and her choices. Barbara Pewterschmidt is still playing her role as the medicated, emotionally distant matriarch, still pretending everything is fine, still unable to acknowledge or address any of the dysfunction in her family. Barbara could have been an ally to Lois, could have helped her daughter break free from the family's toxic patterns, but Barbara is too trapped in her own dysfunction to help anyone else. She's a cautionary tale about what happens when you spend your whole life suppressing your true self to maintain appearances. The Griffin children are all still young enough that their paths aren't set, but without serious intervention, their futures look bleak. Meg is likely to end up in an abusive relationship because she's been conditioned to accept mistreatment as normal. She'll probably perpetuate the cycle with her own children if she has them, passing on the message that her worth depends on her usefulness to others, and that accepting abuse is the price of being loved. Chris is heading toward a life of underachievement and possibly substance abuse, or other destructive behaviors. He's learning that trying is pointless, and that failure is inevitable. So why bother? Stewie's intelligence might save him, but it might also make things worse. He could channel his genius into something positive, or he could become a truly dangerous person, using his gifts for destructive ends because he's never learned empathy or healthy ways to connect with others. Brian will probably remain with the Griffins until he dies, never achieving his dreams, never breaking his pattern of failed relationships, never addressing his alcoholism or his deeper psychological issues. He'll continue to position himself as superior to the family while being just as trapped in dysfunction as they are. His life is a tragedy of wasted potential and unaddressed trauma, and unless something changes, that's how it will end. Peter and Lois are likely to stay together, not because their relationship is healthy, but because they're both too afraid of change and too committed to their shared history of poor decisions to start over. They'll continue their cycle of fights and reconciliations, betrayals and recommitments, each one doing damage to the other and to their children, but neither one capable of breaking free. They're bound together by dysfunction more than by love. Two damaged people who found each other and have spent their lives creating more damage rather than healing. The saddest part of the Griffin family's forgotten past is that it didn't have to be this way. At multiple points, any of them could have made different choices that might have broken the cycle. Thelma could have left Francis and raised Peter in a healthier environment. Lois could have gotten therapy and dealt with her family trauma before having children. Peter could have sought help for his issues instead of just repeating his father's mistakes. But they didn't make those choices, partly because they didn't know they could, and partly because the dysfunction was so normalized that they couldn't even see it for what it was. Generational trauma works this way. It's passed down not through genetics, but through learned behavior, through normalized dysfunction, through patterns that repeat because no one knows any different. The Griffins are trapped in patterns that go back generations. Patterns of emotional abuse, neglect, addiction, financial irresponsibility, and relationship dysfunction. Each generation adds their own variations to the pattern, but the core dysfunction remains the same. What's forgotten about the Griffin family is that they're not just a cartoon family doing absurd things for laughs. They're a representation of how real families can be trapped in cycles of pain that span generations. They're showing us, through exaggeration and absurdity, what happens when trauma goes unaddressed, when people don't develop healthy coping mechanisms, when dysfunction becomes so normalized that it's invisible to those living in it. The Griffin family's forgotten past is really a story about how the wounds of one generation become the weapons of the next, how pain that isn't healed is pain that gets passed on, how children who grow up in dysfunction become adults who create dysfunction because it's all they know. Every member of the Griffin family is suffering in their own way, trapped in patterns they didn't create but don't know how to escape. Peter is still that little boy, desperate for his father's approval. Lois is still that young woman, trying to figure out who she is apart from her family's expectations. Meg is absorbing everyone's dysfunction and learning that her value is in what she can tolerate. Chris is learning that he's not capable of anything better. Stewie is developing defense mechanisms that will damage him for life. Brian is drowning his disappointment in alcohol. And the cycle continues, generation after generation, because no one knows how to stop it. The forgotten past of the Griffin family isn't really about specific events or long-lost relatives, though those elements are part of it. The real forgotten past is the accumulated trauma, the normalized abuse, the learned dysfunction that each generation inherits and passes on without even realizing what they're doing. It's the way Francis's father damaged Francis, who damaged Peter, who is now damaging his own children. It's the way Carter's family created the values that Carter passed to Lois, who is now passing them to her children. It's the way everyone in the family is hurting and has been hurt, but no one has the tools or knowledge to break the cycle. The most disturbing thing about the Griffin family's forgotten past is how familiar it might feel to many people watching the show. Stripped of the cartoon absurdity, the core dynamics of the Griffin family are not that different from many real families. The parents struggling with their own unresolved trauma, the children caught in the crossfire, the patterns repeating across generations, the dysfunction that's so normalized that it's invisible, the inability to communicate, to express love, to break free from destructive patterns. These are real issues that real families face every day. The Griffin family represents an extreme version of what happens when these issues go unaddressed for generations. They're a cautionary tale wrapped in comedy, showing us what happens when people don't heal from their traumas, when families don't acknowledge their problems, when dysfunction becomes the status quo. Every joke about Peter's stupidity is a reminder of how Francis's abuse damaged Peter's development. Every joke about Lois's coldness is a reminder of how Barbara's emotional distance shaped Lois's ability to connect with her own children. Every joke about Meg's treatment by the family is a reminder of how scapegoating destroys a child's sense of self-worth. The writers of Family Guy probably never intended for the family's history to be this dark when examined closely. They were creating comedy, not a case study in generational trauma. But the consistency of the characters and their behaviors has created a portrait of dysfunction that's remarkably coherent when you look at all the pieces together. The Griffin family's forgotten past is hidden in plain sight throughout the series, in throwaway lines, in character behaviors, in running jokes that become much less funny when you understand the psychology behind them. Understanding the Griffin family's forgotten past doesn't make the show less entertaining, but it does add layers of meaning to what otherwise might seem like random comedy. It shows how carefully constructed these characters are, how their behaviors all stem from psychological realities, even if those realities are exaggerated for comedic effect. It demonstrates how even in a show as absurd as Family Guy, there are threads of genuine human experience and emotion woven throughout. The legacy of the Griffin family is still being written. The children are still young, their stories still unfolding. There's still time for things to change, for someone to break the cycle, for healing to begin. But based on everything we've seen, based on the patterns that have been established over generations, based on the consistent failure of anyone in the family to truly change or grow, the outlook is not optimistic. The Griffin family's future will likely look a lot like their past: messy, dysfunctional, painful, and wrapped in enough humor and absurdity that everyone can pretend it's all okay. What's really forgotten about the Griffin family is that underneath all the comedy and absurdity, they're a family in pain. They're trapped in patterns they didn't choose and don't know how to escape. They hurt each other not because they're evil, but because they're repeating the only patterns they know. They fail at relationships, at parenting, at basic functioning, not because they don't care, but because they're working with broken tools, trying to build something healthy out of the wreckage of their own damaged childhoods. Peter never learned how to be a good father because he never had a good father. Lois never learned how to be emotionally available because she never had an emotionally available mother. Meg is learning to accept abuse because that's what her family has taught her love looks like. Chris is learning that he's worthless because that's the message he gets every day. Stewie is learning that the world is hostile and that the only person he can rely on is himself. Brian is learning that dreams are for other people and that disappointment should be drowned rather than faced. These are the real lessons being passed down in the Griffin family. The forgotten curriculum of dysfunction that each generation teaches the next. And until someone in that family recognizes what's happening, until someone gets help and breaks the cycle, until someone decides that the pain stops. Here with them, with this generation, the Griffin family's story will continue to be one of perpetual dysfunction, a comedy to the outside world, but a tragedy to those living inside it. The Griffin family's forgotten past is ultimately a story about all of us, about the baggage we inherit, the patterns we repeat, the pain we pass on without meaning to. It's about how childhood shapes us, how family dysfunction echoes through generations, how difficult it is to be different from what we were taught to be. It's a reminder that healing is possible, but requires recognition, that change is possible, but requires courage, that breaking cycles is possible, but requires someone to finally say, enough is enough. In the end, the most forgotten thing about the Griffin family might be the most important. They're not just cartoon characters. They're mirrors, reflecting our own family dynamics back at us, exaggerated and absurd, but fundamentally recognizable. Their forgotten past is a compilation of all the small betrayals, normalized dysfunctions, and unresolved traumas that make up any family's hidden history. And maybe, by seeing their dysfunction so clearly, we can better recognize and address our own, can choose to be the generation that breaks the cycle rather than perpetuating it, can decide that the pain stops with us and doesn't get passed on to those who come after. That would be the real legacy of the Griffin family, not their cartoon adventures or outrageous situations, but their unintentional reminder that families are complex, that dysfunction is insidious, that pain passes through generations unless someone stands up and stops it. The Griffin family's forgotten past is every family's forgotten past. The accumulated weight of generations of hurt that we carry until we finally decide to put it down.